In the vast, silent desert of the heart, the deepest wounds are not carved by strangers, but by the hands we once held. The coarse rope bit into Eliza's wrists, a merciless grip that sent waves of fire through her veins. Each frantic beat of her heart echoed the throbbing pain in the bruises that marred her skin, ugly purple blossoms left by her own brother's hand. She was tied to a gnarled, sun-bleached tree that stood as a lonely sentinel in the vast, indifferent desert. The relentless sun beat down, stealing the moisture from her lips and blurring the horizon into a shimmering haze. She tried to draw a deep breath, but the ropes around her chest constricted, a constant reminder of her helplessness. Despair, cold and sharp, threatened to consume her, but beneath it, a tiny ember of defiance still glowed, refusing to be extinguished by the cruelty of men. The leader of the bandits, a man whose face was a roadmap of a harsh life, swaggered toward her. His eyes, small and dark, held a glint of predatory amusement. A cruel smile twisted his lips, revealing teeth stained brown and yellow. He stopped just before her, the smell of stale whiskey and unwashed grime assaulting her senses. "This is just a warm-up, pretty thing," he rasped, his voice like gravel scraping stone. He drew a long hunting knife, its blade catching the sunlight. With a single, brutal motion, he sliced off a lock of her blonde hair. It drifted down to the dusty ground, a silken sacrifice to his casual brutality. His laughter was a dry, rattling sound that seemed to mock the silence of the desert. Eliza squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the leering face in the glint of the knife. She transported herself back to the ranch, to the familiar scent of hay and leather, the gentle lowing of the cattle at dusk. She thought of her father, his kind eyes and steady hands. The memory was a sanctuary, a fragile shield against the terrifying present, but the rough texture of the bark against her back, and the searing pain in her wrists, dragged her back to reality. She was alone, miles from anyone who could help, a pawn in her brother's greedy game. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would endure. The other men gathered around, their laughter joining their leaders, a chorus of malice that echoed in the oppressive heat. They saw her not as a person, but as an object for their amusement, a diversion in the desolate landscape. "Look at the little bird, all tied up," one of them sneered. "Maybe we should teach her to sing." They circled her like vultures, their shadows dancing on the ground. Eliza kept her gaze fixed on the distant mountains, their rugged peaks, a symbol of the strength she needed to find within herself. She knew this was only the beginning. Their eyes promised more pain, more humiliation, and she braced herself for the darkness that was yet to come, praying for a deliverance she did not believe would arrive. It had all started a month ago, under the same vast, unforgiving sky, but within the comforting walls of her home. The shadow of death had fallen over the sprawling ranch when the doctor, a grim man with weary eyes, had delivered his verdict. John, her father, a man who seemed as strong and enduring as the ancient oaks on his land, was confined to his bed. A month, perhaps less, the doctor had said, his voice low and somber. The words had hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Eliza had sat by his bedside, holding his large, calloused hand, watching the life slowly fade from the man who had been her rock, her guide, her entire world. The ranch, once so full of life, suddenly felt silent and hollow. John lay in his bed, the familiar landscape outside his window, a painful reminder of all he was leaving behind. He knew his children well. He saw the future of his legacy in Eliza, her spirit as gentle as it was resilient, her hands as capable of tending a garden as they were of managing the ranch's ledgers. And he saw the ruin in William. His son's soul was consumed by whiskey and the fever of the poker table. Just last week, word had reached him of William's latest loss at the saloon in town. A staggering sum owed to a man with no patience for debtors. William was waiting for him to die, waiting to turn this land, this life's work, into a pile of silver dollars to be squandered on cards and cheap liquor. The decision settled in John's heart, heavy but clear. He would not allow his legacy to be burned away in a saloon fire. He summoned his lawyer from town, a portly man who smelled of dusty books and stale cigars. With a weak but steady voice, John dictated the terms of his final will. The ranch, the cattle, the land, every last acre and every last dollar would go to Eliza. "She has the heart for this place," John explained, his voice barely a whisper. "She understands the land does not just belong to us. We belong to it." He felt a pang of sorrow for the son he had lost long before this illness, but his duty to the future, to Eliza, was absolute. He signed the document, his hand trembling slightly. Later that day, he called William to his bedside. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken resentment. John did not waste words. He told his son of his decision, his voice firm despite his weakness. He watched as the color drained from William's face, replaced by a chilling stillness. It was not the explosive anger of a disappointed son, but something far colder, far more terrifying. A flicker of pure, calculated hatred ignited in William's eyes. In that moment, John saw the monster his son had become, a creature born of greed and entitlement. As William turned and walked out of the room without a word, John felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with his own impending death. Eliza carried a tray with a bowl of broth and a glass of cool water toward her father's room. The house was quiet, filled with the heavy stillness of waiting. As she approached the door, it swung open and William emerged. His face was a thunderous mask of fury, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumped in his cheek. He stormed past her, nearly knocking the tray from her hands, his eyes fixed on some distant point of rage. He did not acknowledge her presence, did not utter a single word. A shiver of unease traced its way down Eliza's spine. She had seen her brother angry before, but this was different. This was a silent, venomous rage that seemed to poison the very air around him. She entered her father's room to find him pale and exhausted, his gaze troubled. After helping him with the broth, she stepped back out into the hallway, her mind still unsettled by William's demeanor. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on her arm like a steel trap. It was William. He had been waiting for her. Before she could cry out, he began to drag her down the hall and out the back door. "William, what are you doing? You are hurting me," she pleaded, her feet stumbling to keep up with his furious pace. He remained silent, his grip unrelenting, his purpose a terrifying mystery. As he pulled her across the dusty yard toward the dark, cavernous mouth of the old barn, he shoved her inside, the familiar scent of hay and dust doing little to comfort her rising panic. Ignoring her questions and her tears, he roughly pushed her onto a pile of hay and began to bind her hands and feet with a length of old rope. "Please, William, talk to me. Whatever Father said, we can work it out," she begged, but her words fell on deaf ears. He worked with a cold, methodical efficiency, his movements precise and devoid of any emotion save for a chilling determination. When he was finished, he stood over her for a moment, his shadow engulfing her. Then, without a backward glance, he turned and left, pulling the heavy barn doors shut, and plunging her into darkness and a profound, terrifying silence. She spent the day and the long, cold night alone in the dark, her fear a living thing that gnawed at her. The following evening, the barn doors creaked open, and she saw William's silhouette against the fading light. He was not alone. 4 other men stood with him, their shapes hulking and menacing. They were rough-looking men, the kind who haunted the corners of saloons and lived on the fringes of the law. William tossed a heavy sack to one of them, the clink of silver coins echoing in the quiet barn. "She is yours," William said, his voice flat and empty of all brotherly affection. "Make sure she disappears for good. But have your fun first." It is time she learned what the real world is like. The journey was a blur of rough handling and choking dust. The bandits threw Eliza onto a horse like a sack of grain and rode hard, pushing deep into the desolate prairie where the land stretched out flat and empty in every direction. The rhythmic pounding of the hooves was a drumbeat of doom, carrying her further and further from everything she had ever known. When they finally stopped, the sun was a fiery orb hanging low in the western sky, painting the clouds in shades of blood and orange. There were no signs of civilization here, no hope of a chance encounter, only the vast, silent expanse of a land that did not care whether she lived or died. They pulled her from the horse and her legs buckled, weak from her long confinement. They untied her, and for a fleeting moment she thought they might let her go. The hope was a fool's dream. "Time for a dance," the leader grunted, grabbing her by the arm. He spun her around, his grip bruising, his foul breath hot on her face. The others laughed and took their turns, forcing her into a grotesque parody of a dance. They were clumsy and cruel, their hands pawing at her, their boots stomping near her bare feet. Her simple cotton dress, a favorite she had sewn herself, was torn in the struggle, the sound of ripping fabric like a scream in the quiet air. Their wild, drunken laughter was the only music, a terrible soundtrack to her humiliation. When they grew tired of their game, they dragged her to the solitary, weathered tree. This time, they tied the ropes with a practiced cruelty, pulling them so tight that each breath became a painful, shallow gasp. The rough bark scraped her back, and the bonds on her wrists and ankles cut off the flow of blood, her limbs growing numb and cold. She was pinned, helpless, a captive audience for their next act of barbarity. The leader stood back to admire his work, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. "Now, we make it look like the work of savages," he announced, his voice filled with a sneering contempt that made Eliza's stomach turn. One of the men produced a bundle containing several tomahawks, their stone heads chipped and their wooden handles decorated with crude carvings. He handed one to each of his companions. "Let us see how close you can get without hitting the prize," the leader chuckled. They took turns throwing the weapons, which thudded into the tree trunk around her, sometimes just inches from her head or her body. With each thud, Eliza flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs. They were deliberately prolonging her terror, drawing out her suffering for their own sick amusement. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows as the deadly game continued in the twilight. As the last sliver of sun vanished, a lone figure appeared on a distant ridge, silhouetted against the deep purple of the twilight sky. The rider sat motionless on his horse, a study in stillness, observing the scene below. It was Akachita, a Lakota warrior who had been tracking a mountain lion since dawn. His hunt had led him far from his people's camp, into these contested lands. His keen eyes, accustomed to spotting the slightest movement, took in the fire, the rough men, and the woman tied to the tree. He saw the glint of a thrown tomahawk, and understood instantly the cruel deception being played out. A cold, quiet anger settled over him. This was a violation of the land, an act of profound dishonor. He urged his horse forward not with a wild cry, but with a silent, deadly purpose. The animal moved swiftly and surely down the rocky incline, its hooves making little sound on the dry earth. The bandits were so engrossed in their cruel sport that they did not notice his approach until he was nearly upon them. When they finally saw him, their surprise quickly turned to drunken bravado. "Look what we have here," one of them shouted. "A real savage come to join the party." The leader raised his rifle, taking a hasty aim. Akachita spurred his horse, charging directly at the man. A shot rang out, the flash momentarily illuminating the scene. The bullet tore through the flesh of Akachita's shoulder, the impact knocking him clean off his horse. He hit the ground hard, the air forced from his lungs. For a moment, the world spun into a dark, painful vortex. The bandits let out a triumphant cheer, believing their unexpected problem was solved. "That takes care of that," the leader said with a laugh, lowering his rifle. "Let us go see what the heathens carry in their pouches." They sauntered toward Akachita's still form, their boots crunching on the gravel, their guard completely down. They were confident, arrogant, and they had made a fatal mistake. As they loomed over him, Akachita moved with the startling speed of a coiled snake. He had been playing possum, waiting for his moment. Ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder, he rolled onto his back and drew the revolver holstered at his side. The weapon seemed to leap into his hand. Before the bandits could even register their error, he fired 3 times in quick succession. The shots were precise, economical, and utterly lethal. 3 of the men crumpled to the ground without a sound. The 4th, the one who had thrown the last tomahawk, screamed as a bullet shattered his leg, sending him crashing to the dirt, his weapon clattering uselessly beside him. Akachita rose to his feet, a grim expression on his face. A hot, wet slickness was spreading across his shoulder, but he paid it no mind. His first priority was the woman. He walked to the tree and, with a few swift cuts of his knife, severed the ropes that held Eliza captive. Her body, deprived of support, slumped forward. He caught her, his arms surprisingly gentle as he eased her to the ground. She was trembling uncontrollably, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. For a long moment she simply stared at him, at the stranger who had appeared out of the twilight like a spirit of vengeance, and saved her from an unspeakable fate. Her story came out in a torrent of broken words and ragged sobs. She told him everything about her dying father, the cruel will, and her brother's monstrous betrayal. She spoke of the dark barn, and the long, terrifying ride into the wilderness. Akecheta listened without interruption, his dark eyes never leaving her face. There was a deep stillness about him, an ancient calm that seemed to absorb her panic and fear. He had heard many stories of the white man's greed and cruelty, but the tale of a brother turning on his own sister with such cold-blooded malice struck a chord of profound sorrow within him. He saw not just her pain, but the sickness that created it. "We must go to the sheriff," Eliza said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Sheriff Miller in Harmony Creek. He will see that they are punished." Akecheta slowly shook his head, his gaze distant for a moment. "The man you speak of wears a star, but his heart is owned by money," he said, his voice low and even. "He serves men like your brother, not justice. To go to him would be to walk back into the trap." He had seen Miller's brand of law before. It was a law that protected the powerful and punished the weak. A law that had no place for a native warrior or a disinherited woman. He looked at her, his expression serious. "There is another way. A longer path, a harder one, to the next county. There is a federal marshal there, a man called Reeves. He is a man of true law, a man who cannot be bought." Eliza looked from the stoic face of her rescuer to the groaning, wounded bandit on the ground. She was being asked to place her life, her future, in the hands of a complete stranger, a man her people would call a savage. But in his eyes, she saw not savagery, but a quiet strength and an unwavering integrity. It was a greater trust than she had ever seen in the so-called civilized world. "I will go with you," she whispered. They bound the wounded bandit securely, gagging him to prevent his shouts from attracting unwanted attention. The journey began under a blanket of stars, the vast prairie illuminated by a sliver of moon. Akecheta moved with a quiet confidence, leading them through the darkness as if he could read the land itself. When they finally made camp, he built a small, smokeless fire. He tended to his own shoulder wound first, cleaning it with a practiced hand. Then, he turned to Eliza, gently dabbing at the rope burns on her wrists with a cloth soaked in a soothing herbal mixture he prepared. His touch was light, respectful, and for the first time in days, she felt a sense of safety. The next day, as they traveled under the hot sun, a quiet companionship began to form between them. Akecheta was a man of few words, but he was a patient teacher. He showed her how to find north using the sun, how to identify edible plants, and how to read the subtle signs of animal tracks in the dirt. He spoke of the earth not as something to be conquered, but as a living being to be respected. Eliza, in turn, found herself opening up to him. She spoke of her love for the ranch, not just as property, but as a home filled with memories, a place her heart was tied to. He listened intently, his silence an invitation for her to share her world. She told him about the books she had read, stories of faraway places and different times. It felt strange to speak of such things in this rugged, untamed landscape, but he did not seem to find it foolish. He asked questions, his curiosity genuine. He wanted to understand her world, just as she was beginning to understand his. She learned that his name, Akecheta, meant warrior in his language. He did not speak of battles or glory, but of his duty to protect his people and their way of life. In his quiet dignity, she saw a nobility that shamed the greedy, plotting men of her own society. A fragile, unspoken affection began to bloom between them in the vast wilderness. Their prisoner, whose name they learned was Cole, alternated between sullen silence and venomous insults. "You are a fool to trust him," he spat at Eliza one afternoon. "He is just a heathen. He will turn on you." But his words were empty, his poison ineffective. The bond between Eliza and Akecheta was not built on words, but on shared hardship and mutual respect. They were two people from different worlds, thrown together by violence and betrayal, who were discovering a common humanity under the endless sky. The journey was arduous and fraught with peril, but with each passing mile their trust in each other deepened, forging a connection stronger than any steel. Back at the ranch, the air in the grand parlor was thick with false solemnity. John had been laid to rest 2 days prior, and now the time had come for the reading of the will. William stood by the fireplace, dressed in black, a picture of feigned grief. Sheriff Miller stood beside him, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered revolver, a symbol of the corrupt authority that sanctioned this charade. The lawyer, Mr. Gable, cleared his throat nervously, the legal document trembling slightly in his hands. He was a man who preferred paperwork to confrontation, and he could feel the tension in the room like a gathering storm. Mr. Gable began to read in a dry, monotonous voice. He detailed the smaller bequests, the payments to loyal ranch hands, the donation to the town church. Then he reached the main clause concerning the estate. "To my beloved daughter Eliza," he read, his voice faltering slightly, "I bequeath the entirety of my property, including the ranch, all livestock, and all financial assets." A muscle twitched in William's jaw. Sheriff Miller shifted his weight, preparing to deliver the testimony he had been paid so handsomely for. He was ready to declare that Eliza had tragically perished, the victim of a savage attack, leaving William as the sole and rightful heir. Just as Miller opened his mouth to speak, the heavy oak doors of the parlor swung open with a resounding crash. Every head in the room turned. Framed in the doorway stood Eliza, her clothes torn and travel-stained, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a fierce, unwavering light. Behind her stood the imposing figure of Akachita, his presence filling the room with a silent, powerful authority. And beside him stood a tall, broad-shouldered man, with a grim face and a silver star pinned to his vest that read U.S. Marshal. It was Marshal Reeves. The room was plunged into a stunned, absolute silence. Marshal Reeves gave the wounded bandit Cole a firm shove, sending him stumbling into the center of the room. Cole collapsed onto the expensive rug, clutching his leg and glaring at William with pure hatred. William's carefully constructed facade shattered. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, grayish white. His eyes darted from Eliza to the marshal, to the captured bandit, his mind racing to find an escape from the perfect trap that had just sprung shut around him. The scent of justice, long absent from this house, finally filled the air, as cold and sharp as a winter wind. The spectacle was over. Eliza took a step forward, her gaze locked on her brother. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the clarity of a bell. "It is over, William," she said, her tone a mixture of sorrow and steel. "You will not get the ranch. You will not get a single cent of Father's money." She was not just reclaiming her inheritance. She was reclaiming her life, her dignity, from the man who had tried to strip her of everything. For a moment, William simply stared at her, his expression a maelstrom of shock, fury, and disbelief. He saw his future, a future of wealth and power, dissolving into dust before his very eyes. In that moment, the last thread of reason in William's mind snapped. The carefully controlled mask of the grieving son and wronged heir fell away, revealing the desperate, cornered animal beneath. His world had collapsed, and his only instinct was to lash out, to destroy the source of his ruin. His eyes, wild and bloodshot, fixed on his sister. It was all her fault. With a guttural roar of pure, unadulterated rage, he lunged not at the marshal but at the unsuspecting Sheriff Miller, his hand clawing for the revolver in the man's holster. It all happened in a heartbeat. Before Marshal Reeves or Akacheta could react, William had the revolver in his hand. He raised the weapon, his arm shaking with fury, and pointed it directly at Eliza. He fired. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. Eliza cried out, a sharp, pained sound, as the force of the impact threw her backward. She crumpled to the floor, a still, broken figure on the polished wood. Akacheta let out a cry of anguish and rushed to her side, his heart seized by an icy dread. He knelt beside her, gently turning her over, fearing the worst, fearing he had brought her all this way only to see her die. A dark stain was spreading across the bodice of her dress, but as Akacheta's hand hovered over the wound, he felt a faint, steady rhythm beneath his palm, a heartbeat. Eliza's eyes fluttered open, filled with pain and confusion. With a trembling hand, she reached into her dress and pulled out her father's silver pocket watch. It was shattered. The front caved in, but it had stopped the bullet. The heavy silver, a final gift from a loving father, had saved her life. Akacheta looked from the ruined watch to her face, a wave of overwhelming relief washing over him. He had not lost her. The sight of his sister, alive but fallen by his own hand, seemed to finally break through William's murderous rage. A look of dawning horror washed over his face as the full weight of his actions crashed down upon him. He dropped the revolver as if it had burned him, and took a stumbling step toward Eliza, his mouth opening but no words coming out. But it was far too late for remorse. Marshal Reeves moved with grim efficiency, disarming the stunned Sheriff Miller and clapping heavy iron cuffs onto both his and William's wrists. "Your brand of law is finished in this county," the marshal said, his voice cold as iron, as he hauled the two men away. Justice, when it came, was swift and unyielding. William and the former Sheriff Miller were tried and convicted, their crimes laid bare for all to see. They were sentenced to hard labor in a remote territorial prison, a fate that would slowly grind them down to nothing. The news of their sentence brought Eliza no joy, only a quiet, somber sense of closure. The poison of her brother's greed had been purged from the land, and the long shadow of his betrayal had finally begun to recede. The ranch was hers, free and clear, a legacy of her father's love and her own incredible resilience. A year passed, the seasons turned, and life returned to the ranch. Under Eliza's guidance, and with Akacheta's quiet wisdom, the land flourished. The bond forged between them in the harsh wilderness had deepened into a profound and abiding love. They were married in a simple ceremony under the wide open sky, a union not of two families or two fortunes, but of two hearts that had found a home in each other. He taught her the ways of his people, and she shared with him her world of books and music, their lives weaving together to create something new and beautiful, a testament to the idea that love could bridge any divide. Eliza used a portion of her inheritance to build a small schoolhouse on a corner of the ranch property, a place where the children of Akacheta's tribe could learn to read and write alongside the children of the ranch hands. It was a place of hope, a bridge between their two worlds. A few years later, their own daughter was born, a child with her mother's bright eyes and her father's serene spirit. She was a living symbol of their love, a promise of a better future. Justice had triumphed, and on the land where the bitter wormwood grew, something strong and beautiful had taken root and blossomed.